Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Andrew Shikiar. I lead marketing here at FIDO Alliance. 2018 is coming towards an end, and it's been a very busy year for FIDO, headlined by the release and early product adoption of FIDO 2. But when we look at the technology and business landscape more broadly, I think it's fair to say that many of the 2018 headlines centered on regulatory initiatives in Europe, including PSD2 and GDPR, both of which FIDO follows closely, in which we feel like the FIDO specifications can help companies address. That will be the topic for today's webinar, and I'm very pleased to have two expert speakers today who will talk about how FIDO authentication relates to the General Data Protection Regulation. Our speakers today are Alan Martin, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Gemalto. He's also a director on the FIDO Alliance board and the co-chair of the FIDO Europe Working Group. We also have Jeremy Grant. Jeremy is the Managing Director of Technology Business Strategy at Venable and a Policy Advisor to FIDO Alliance. And I'll be here moderating our Q&A later today as well. On that note, I want to just address a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. So first of all, yes, this will be recorded and the slides and replay will be shared with you afterwards. Secondly, if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the GoToWebinar client. You'll see a little dialog box there where you can ask questions. I will answer them midstream if applicable, and otherwise we'll take them in Q&A at the end. Any questions that are not answered, we will address via follow-up email. Last but not least, you'll see a survey at the end of the webinar. If you could take a few moments to fill this out, we'd greatly appreciate that, as your feedback really helps inform and shape our webinar program. So with that, I'm now very pleased to introduce Alan Martin, who will run you through an overview of FIDO Alliance. Alan.
Thank you, Andrew. So I will just indeed start this webinar with an introduction to FIDO for those of you who are not familiar with this organization. So FIDO is an alliance of industry players across several industry sectors, as authentication is a very horizontal subject. And FIDO focuses strictly on authentication standards. That's the only thing we do. So we specify, we create documentations, and we run a certification program. So behind the specs, there is also testing and certification with a stamp delivered by the FIDO Alliance. They are actually close to 250 members in the FIDO Alliance today. As you can see, there are now more than 500 certified solutions, which makes FIDO actually the largest ecosystem for standardized authentication. So in the general picture of user identification for online services, again, the scope of FIDO is very focused on authentication. And I should precise here that we don't look at passwords at all. On the contrary, FIDO's scope is to replace passwords, and God knows we're going to talk about that today, with stronger means of authentication or risk-based authentication, and a heavy emphasis on the use of biometrics. This shows you the members of the board of FIDO, and it gives you a good idea of the types of companies that join in the alliance. So you have very big players, both in consumer electronics, with, for example, with Microsoft and Google, platform vendors, but also PC vendors, phone vendors, chip vendors, all that contribute to making consumer electronics. In the middle, you find various members that specialize in security or biometric implementations. Okay, again, you find large names like Gemalto or IDEMIA or Ubico, and so on. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the service providers that make use of FIDO. And here again, you see large players, whether in the banking industry like Visa and MasterCard or ING, or in the healthcare industry with Aetna, or in e-commerce with Amazon. So you find fairly large players that all contribute to making FIDO a success. As I said, authentication is a very horizontal subject. So basically all industry sectors are potential users of FIDO. And as you see today, FIDO used in the banking industry, in e-commerce, in social media, in enterprise security, and I'll come back to that when I talk about FIDO2, but also in the government sector with several implementations and more to come, actually. This shows you the different protocols that are part of the FIDO standards. The first one is called UAF, which stands for Universal Authentication Framework, which is a standard that completely replaces passwords with a device with which you're going to authenticate. And it is a multi-factor authentication standard, meaning that on that device, you're going to enter a PIN code or enter biometric data verified locally, and then the device authenticates online to the service. U2F is a protocol that exists to deal with legacy password systems. So instead of breaking up completely the authentication procedure that some service providers have in place, the idea is to continue using the login and password, but add the possession factor for strong authentication. That's U2F. FIDO2, you've probably seen in the press some recent announcements. We started releasing, issuing press releases around FIDO2 back in the first semester, but there's been more following because FIDO2 is integrating FIDO standard authentication in the web browsers and in platforms more generally speaking. FIDO2 is based on two different components. First, WebAuthent standard, which are APIs specified by the W3C. So this work has been done with a collaboration between FIDO and W3C, so that the latest browsers, and you can see them on the right-hand side with Firefox, and Edge, and Chrome, all supporting now the WebAuthent APIs in their latest release. And actually, last week, there was an announcement by Apple. The Safari is now also supporting the WebAuthent APIs in a test mode. And so this is very good news for the industries at large, because it's going to greatly facilitate the introduction of strong customer authentication in web-based applications. The second aspect of FIDO2 is a standard created by FIDO, which is the CTAP, the Client to Authenticate Protocol, which facilitates the connection between a platform like a PC to an external device like a USB key or a smart card or even a phone. And so the combination of WebAuthent and CTAP is the FIDO2 standard. Recently also there were announcements of both Google and Microsoft that they support now natively in their platforms the FIDO2 protocol. So Windows 10 comes with FIDO2 embedded in the latest versions, and so does Android. This shows you the principles of FIDO authentication in a nutshell, and in the later part of this presentation we'll come back to some aspects of FIDO. But very quickly, so the principles of FIDO is you have a device which is the authenticator, and in this authenticator key pairs are generated. So FIDO uses public key technology, and keys are generated within the device. The private key stays in the device at all times. It's not readable. You can't export it. But you do export the public key. So the public key is sent to the relying party, to the service provider. And the authentication procedure is a two-step procedure. First, with a local user verification step, where the user presents something to the authenticator. For example, it will enter a PIN code, which will be verified locally by the authenticator, or it will present a fingerprint, or take a face recognition, and all being verified locally by the authenticator. And this is an important feature. We'll come back to that because it does have an impact on GDPR. After this successful first step, the authenticator will sign, there's a cryptographic mechanism in FIDO, a challenge sent by the service provider to the device. And this signed response is returned to the relying party for verification with the public key. The verification of the signed response serves two purposes. It proves you have the right device. It also proves that you did the first part correctly. So it proves that the PIN code or the biometric data was properly verified by the authenticator, because that is a prerequisite. So by verifying the signed response, the relying party authenticates strongly with multi-factor authentication the user. I'll now hand over to Jeremy to talk to you about the General Data Protection Regulation and those aspects that relate to authentication. Jeremy?
Thank you, Alan, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining today. As background, as Andrew mentioned at the beginning, I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm Managing Director of Technology Business Strategy at Venable. We're a law firm based out of Washington, D.C. Within the U.S., what's the country's largest legal practice focused on privacy and data security, though I'm not an attorney. But it's particularly germane given that so much of the work we've been doing over the last year, engaging globally, has been to advise clients on the impact of GDPR and what it might mean. And so some of the comments we'll give today are certainly driven from some of what we've seen with our engagements around the globe. As background on GDPR, I think by this point most people are pretty familiar with it. It took effect on May 25th earlier this year. And the thing that I think has certainly gotten companies' attention around the world has been the large potential fines that are out there for violations of it, up to 20 million euros or 4% of your total worldwide turnover or revenues, whichever is greater. And while no fines of that size have been assessed as of yet, it's something that has certainly gotten a lot of companies' attention when it comes to compliance. GDPR itself focuses on a number of things in terms of how companies protect data, how they obtain consents from individuals, what rights individuals have when their data is being collected in different transactions. It also does some things to lay out special protections for what people would call sensitive data, and we'll talk a little bit more about what some of those means, as well as different criteria on the adequacy and relevance of data collection. So we're going to focus primarily on those first four bullets today in terms of talking about some of the things that are tied to authentication. So, going forward, I'd say there's really three things to know in terms of where GDPR really impacts authentication. And a lot of this was covered in more detail in a white paper that FIDO Alliance published earlier this year, back in May, which I believe if you go to the handout section of your webinar is available for download today. It's also available on the FIDO Alliance website. And the three things, the first is that data breaches have consequences. Between setting requirements in place for 72-hour breach notification as well as potential big fines, I think it's clear every company has some significant incentives, both from a money perspective as well as a reputation perspective, to get this right. With this, as we'll talk about today, organizations really have more incentive now than ever before to put proper security controls in place. And as we'll talk about, authentication, particularly the right kind of authentication, is a critical security control. Second, there's new requirements that require companies to allow individuals to view, change, delete, or transfer their data. So that raises a question of how do you do this while also ensuring that the identity of individuals making these requests are authenticated. And third, GDPR calls out biometrics as a type of data that's requiring special attention. It's one of several types of sensitive data that GDPR says warrants particularly robust data protection. There's some specific restrictions that are sent out with regard to biometrics that don't necessarily apply to other types of data. And we've seen at least one data protection authority, the CNIL in France, has now put out specific guidance on biometrics that, among other things, exempts many biometric solutions if they store biometrics locally, as FIDO Alliance solutions do, and meet some other conditions. So when it comes to data breaches, let me just run down real quick a few of the provisions that are in GDPR. Article 5 makes clear that personal data will be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data. Article 25 is particularly noteworthy in that it states that data protection by design and by default is a principle of all solutions that are developed. And so this means to the extent that authentication solutions are part of that, by design, you need to protect authentication credentials and biometric data from any compromise. You need to have protections against phishing or man-in-the-middle attacks, and you need protections against any third parties that might be able to leverage information that they're getting from an authentication ceremony to infer the identity of those parties that are authenticated. Article 32 puts some specific requirements in place for data security. Articles 33 and 34 define specific requirements for data breach notification. And as we're talking about data breaches, a big question that constantly comes up every time there's a big news story where something happens and millions of records are lost is, why do bad things keep happening to good people? It's a course, a question that doesn't go just in authentication, just in data breaches, but I think across the board. But I think the more important question is not why do these things keep happening, but rather how. How do bad things keep happening to good people? And when we start to look at the actual evidence over the last 5 or 6 years of how bad breaches keep happening, the common themes keeps coming up time and time again, which is that inadequate authentication is far and away the most exploited attack vector. So I think the next slide has an excerpt from Verizon's most recent data breach investigations report, or this was a 2017 version, which shows that a remarkable 81% of hacking-related breaches leverage either stolen or weak passwords. That means it's basically an anomaly when a breach happens these days, and the password or other inadequate authentication isn't at the root of it. And going a little bit deeper in terms of, it's not just the password, but often what you do with it afterwards. There was a study that came out about 3 years ago from the folks at SecureWorks, which are a managed security provider. And it was, to me, one of the most fascinating things I read as somebody who, as part of his job, has over the last few years tried to keep track of where major breaches are happening, how they're happening, what are the attack vectors that are being exploited, what are the methods that our adversaries are taking against us when they're looking to launch these attacks. And one of the things that really stood out from this report was they were saying in all of the security incidents that our companies responded to this year, this was from the SecureWorks perspective, we're not even seeing malware. People are just stealing passwords. They're leveraging the target's own system credentials, not the quote from it, and legitimate software administration tools to do what they called living off the land, basically leveraging a password to get into a system and then moving freely throughout the company's networks. And so it was really, what stood out to me is their point was, it's not malware that's the problem right now, the problem's passwords. So, further measuring the problem, if you look at some statistics, in 2017, we know that 2.3 billion credentials were stolen just last year alone. There's a reason these numbers keep coming up. It's that it's a really easy attack to execute if you only are protecting something with single-factor authentication. Stolen passwords then lead to things like credential stuffing, where you try to essentially leverage passwords that are stolen to get into other sites. We're now seeing, just in the retail sector alone, 130 million attempts at this each day. And while the overall success rate might be low, say 2%, when you have 130 million attempts, 2% is still a pretty big number. So we have seen between 80 and 90% of e-commerce sites attempted logins are compromised by stuffing, with a pretty significant cost. This is just a U.S. figure, not a global figure, but of quite a bit of money, $5 billion a year. So authentication becomes really important. I think one of the challenges we're seeing these days is, just a few years ago, the guidance would have been, well, if you implement any multi-factor authentication, you're doing well. And the problem we're seeing now is that the attack vectors have changed, and a lot of the first generation solutions we've seen aren't as resilient against attacks as they used to be. So one-time passcodes, which has certainly been the industry standard in the space for years, are still shared secrets at the end of the day. Even if that code is only good for 30 seconds, that's still 30 seconds that in 2018, many attackers are able to essentially phish those codes and compromise systems. And we're seeing this more and more, whether it's through traditional phishing, where somebody's tricked over to hand over their code, leveraging vulnerabilities in the SMS protocols, to the extent that codes are being texted to you rather than being generated from a device or an app. If you have a specific token, they only are good for one application each, which means people get what people call the token necklace, carrying a whole bunch around. And one of the biggest issues these days is the impact overall on the user experience with one-time passwords. Because at the end of the day, the last thing anybody really wants to do, any consumer at least, is after they have gone through the process of remembering a password, is then reach out and try to find a device that then gives them the opportunity to enter a second password, as if the first one wasn't such a joy to enter. There's better ways to do things now, and we'll talk about that today. But from a security perspective, the fact that one-time passcodes are still shared secrets is a real issue, because any shared secret is really not so effective. And I'm on to the next slide now. If we're locking things down with shared secrets, but we're sharing the keys, how effective are those solutions? how effective is cybersecurity solutions and any strategy that still relies upon shared secrets for authentication? And so one thing we're seeing now, moving forward, is a real differentiation in the space between those solutions that are what I would call first-generation legacy solutions for authentication based off of shared secrets, and those that are what Javelin Strategy and Research last year called high assurance strong authentication, which they characterized by a few different measures. One, it has at least two factors. Two, at least one of the factors needs to leverage public key cryptography, the fact being that public key cryptography is not susceptible to phishing, man-in-the-middle, or other attacks targeting credentials because there isn't a shared secret. There's not something to steal. And so it becomes very important when you start thinking about the controls you're going to put in place on this, to protect your security, to deal with not just compliance with GDPR, but to protect, obviously against attacks, that when you're selecting authentication, you're choosing the right kind of authentication. The second area where GDPR is causing some really interesting challenges in the space is that there's requirements for companies to allow individuals to view, change, delete, or transfer their data. And there's a bunch of new rights that have been created for individuals based on GDPR. So starting with a right of access, anybody can essentially go to a company that has their data and ask to see it. A right to rectification, meaning you can ask to change it if it's not correct. A right to erasure, you can ask for somebody to delete your data if you don't want them to have it. And finally, a right to data portability if you'd like to move it someplace else. So this creates a whole bunch of requirements now for companies to put systems in place that can essentially get people back to their own data. So this is turns out to be a bit of a challenge. What could possibly go wrong here? It's not like we haven't had problems with the proverbial dog on the internet over the years, people impersonating somebody else to execute attacks. And, the key element when you're trying to figure out whether somebody really is who they claim to be or not is making sure these requests are authenticated. Organizations must demonstrate that an individual actually did request that their information be changed or moved. And if you fail to do that, you're actually opening up new attack vectors that will be exploited by adversaries, which could, in addition to creating security incidences, also trigger violations of other aspects of the GDPR. So authentication becomes pretty important here. The third thing I wanted to focus on is biometrics, because as I mentioned at the beginning of my discussion, they are a topic, a technology category that requires special attention under GDPR. They're considered sensitive personal data. Article 9 specifically states out processing of biometric data shall be prohibited, although it then goes back to lay out a number of conditions where the prohibition might be lifted. And if you go into the recitals, recital 91 states that when data controllers and processors are looking to process biometric information, they would have to perform a specific data protection impact assessment, the DPIA, prior to the processing activity occurring. Also, with GDPR, it's one of the few places where GDPR states that any of the individual member states within Europe might actually introduce or maintain further conditions, including limitations with regards to the processing of biometric data. So one of the implications here is that companies using biometrics could have to comply with different rules in different parts of the European Union. And so obviously one of the big questions then is if you do want to leverage biometrics because they offer value both for enhanced security as well as enhanced convenience for consumers, how do you choose a biometric solution for something like authentication that embraces the key principles in GDPR rather than conflicts with them or creates additional areas for risk? So one of the things that I think has been most interesting is what we've actually seen come out of France. I mentioned before CNIL earlier this year had put out some specific guidance focusing on the topic of biometrics in personal smartphones. And they specifically differentiated between devices where the template's stored only in the device and is protected and so isn't actually data that's being collected and being processing, and biometric devices that are running on remote servers where you have an entity actually collecting the data and then keeping it and processing it. And so what they basically said is in many cases, and we'll go through them in a moment, if you're only storing the data on the device and if the individual has full control, you can use biometrics in a way that's totally exempt from GDPR. On the other hand, you want to collect biometric data and you actually want to keep it somewhere, that's now covered under GDPR, and your application has to go through a more formal data protection impact assessment. So we found it really interesting from the FIDO Alliance perspective in that when we started to look at the 5 criteria that the French Data Protection Authority laid out for where you can get an exemption, it really read almost exactly along the lines of the way that FIDO's architected. And so we detail some of this on the next slide, where there are 5 different areas where if you can meet these criteria, then you're not subject to GDPR. The first is that the individual uses their device privately, using only their own biometric data to unlock their phone or access applications that they downloaded on their own. Second, the user is only using the biometric authentication, which is already integrated in the device. It's not something that's being collected by a different device or a different sort of solution. Third, the template's only stored in the device, and it's stored in a compartmentalized environment separate from the rest of the device and is not accessible, nor can it be transmitted anywhere outside the device. Fourth, the biometric template stored in the device itself in an encrypted manner, using cryptographic algorithms and key management according to state of the art. And fifth, during the access control itself, only a token or data indicating the success or failure of the recognition of the biometric presented is transmitted. So I'm going to hand things back to Alan now, who will talk a little bit about the ways in which FIDO specifically helps meet GDPR requirements. But from the perspective of 3 things to keep in mind where authentication matters with GDPR, I hope this has been quite helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. So one first thing to mention about FIDO is that FIDO meets an important aspect of the GDPR, which is this notion of protection or privacy by design. The GDPR insists on it. Any implementation of data processing must implement data protection by design. That means that the protection is not something that's reactive to an event. It's proactively built in the very conception of the solution. And FIDO does that. Okay, and you see here a number of aspects of criteria, or aspects of FIDO authentication that do meet this criteria. For example, as Jeremy said, FIDO is based on public key cryptography, meaning that there are no keys shared between the FIDO device and the FIDO server, and so that you cannot attack FIDO authentication through phishing. Also, keys are generated within the device. This is a very important notion. They're not provisioned. You don't provision keys in a FIDO device. The FIDO device generates the keys itself. Okay, and again, the public key is uploaded. The public key is different from the private key. So there's no shared secrets. Also, coming back to what is on the right-hand side of this slide, this no linkability between services or accounts, meaning that with FIDO, we do not manage a user ID number that could be shared between devices and services so that you could track what the user is doing with its device. This does not exist in FIDO. So you cannot link the user to the different services it's using. We mentioned biometrics already. Come back to this notion, but with FIDO, biometrics never leave the device. And finally, FIDO is a protocol between the end user and the service provider directly. You do not involve third parties. And so again, from a privacy perspective, you do not create weaknesses. Jeremy mentioned all of this. Just want to highlight this slide with the fact that one-time passwords are also subject to phishing attacks. And if we look at, on the next slide, at examples of this happening, this is not theory, okay? When I prepared this webinar, I did a quick research on the internet and came up with this Reddit attack. It's not very old, it dates to last August. Reddit, which is a portal very much used in the US, were hacked because they were using SMS OTPs that were broken. So the hackers managed to get the OTPs of genuine users and access the service on their behalf. In banking, this happens as well. this happened last year in Germany with several German banks that were hacked by people that managed to get the OTPs of genuine users. And these hackers actually accessed the account. So we're talking about serious stuff. FIDO authentication, as we saw at the beginning, is based on an exchange between the authenticator and the server with no shared secrets. Besides, the signed response is not visible at all. If we go to the next slide, you will see that this prevents phishing attacks for two reasons. First, because the cryptographic response is not visible, and so there's nothing to enter in a website that a hacker could intercept. But secondly, one aspect of the FIDO protocol is the verification of the web origin. This means that the FIDO device, as part of its features, actually digitally signs the origin, the web address, if you will, of the origin, of the relying party. And the relying party, in return, when it gets a response of the authenticator, will be able to verify that there was no modification of the web origin. And this prevents more sophisticated attacks, called man-in-the-middle attacks, which can happen if you do not get this cryptography involved in the middle. Jeremy described this important aspect of GDPR, which is the sensitivity of biometric data, which you're not supposed to actually process. And here we managed to circumvent the obligation of GDPR because with FIDO, biometric data is stored and matched on the consumer's device. And so it meets the criteria to be exempt from the GDPR. There is no need with FIDO authentication to go through a data protection impact assessment. This is an important aspect of GDPR, which is the user consent. When the processor is going to process these special categories of data, the sensitive data amongst which you find biometrics, but you find also healthcare information. Okay? Healthcare information is considered under GDPR a special category of data for which specific security measures need to be put in place. The GDPR also says that for this kind of data, the user must provide explicit content. Moreover, the GDPR says that the data controller must be able to demonstrate that it obtained the user consent. And so these two notions of obtaining explicit user consent and demonstrating afterwards, in case of disputes, for example, that the data processor did get the user consent, can be met using FIDO. And you see here an example of how you could do that. FIDO has the capability of signing messages. So in the basic principles, you saw that the incoming message is signed and the signed response ensures that you have the proper device and so on. But you can actually, with FIDO, have an incoming message which contains information that can be displayed to the user so that the user explicitly provides consent by authenticating. And so here is an example where you would use a smartphone to explicitly agree to providing your healthcare data to such company. And you confirm with authentication, for example, with your fingerprint. The response that FIDO generates can be used in case of dispute. It is a non-forgeable proof. And though this, again, when you're dealing with special categories of data, is very useful. Finally, with GDPR, you're not talking about just a few people. You're talking about the general population. And so if authentication needs to be put in place, I like the example of healthcare data because we all have healthcare data, and more our healthcare information is being stored in files that can be actually shared amongst healthcare professionals. And so it's a good example of a need for strong authentication in the general public. And so one aspect of FIDO which is particularly of interest when you're dealing with the general public is the fact that you can deploy FIDO authentication in a multiple of ways, multiple form factors. For example, on smartphones, but not everybody has a smartphone. Some people will have smart cards. There are already healthcare smart cards in the market, or other devices. And so the fact that FIDO is a standard that supports multiple implementations across different form factors will ease the deployment of these solutions to the greater public. So we're coming to the end of this presentation. As a key takeaway, I think the picture on this slide summarizes it all. When companies talk about GDPR compliance, they often think about protecting data, encrypting data, minimizing data, anonymizing data, all kind of techniques to actually protect the data at rest in data files. However, the protection methods that you put in place will all be defeated if the way to access this data is only protected by passwords. I think this is the key message of the presentation today. It doesn't make sense to invest in highly secure data protection measures if at the same time there is no investment in better authentication technologies than password. And in light of the heavy fines and the ever-increasing attacks that Jeremy reminded us today, it's very advisable to protect access to data through strong means of authentication. And that's what FIDO does in a standardized way. And the way FIDO works not only is secure and prevents hacking, but especially if it's combined with biometrics, for example, is extremely convenient and simple to use for end users, and so that you can achieve a simple customer journey, which is an important aspect of FIDO. Andrew, back to you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Jeremy, as well. Hopefully this gave everybody on the call a good feel for how FIDO relates to the GDPR and some perspectives therein. What I'd like to do now is open this up for Q&A. We have some questions already entered into the Q&A, kind of the chat box, if you will, on the software client. If you have more, please enter them now, and we'll start answering them momentarily. I also want to note that 2 handouts have been posted to the GoToWebinar client. One is a white paper on FIDO and the GDPR. The other is a kind of a more truncated set of FAQs on how FIDO relates to GDPR. So with that, let me turn to some questions. So I'm going to ask this to both, well, Jeremy, lead with you, and Alan, please jump in if you wish. Have you considered the Kantara consent receipt as a model for assigned response? Is that in scope for FIDO, and any thoughts therein, Jeremy?
I think, Kantara's done a lot of work. For those who don't know Kantara, it's an organization that's also worked on standards and particularly certification, not just for authentication, but broader identity solutions, that often involve identity proofing. Kantara certainly done some good work, here with consent as well. I think everything, FIDO's doing is certainly compatible with it. I think the real issue is, at the end of the day, whatever you're doing for consent, if strong authentication is needed, how do you deploy it in a way, one, that's easy to deploy, in terms of being easy for your end users to use? And certainly, I think something that appeals about FIDO is the enhanced user experience that it can offer relative to some other first-generation strong authentication. And second, how do you know that it's as secure as possible? So there's certainly, Kantara is a liaison partner of the FIDO Alliance, I believe, and there's nothing that's not compatible between the two.
Super, thank you. We have a broad question around FIDO and federation. Let me start with this. While our slides indicate that man-in-the-middle cannot compromise FIDO protocol, in a federated identity management solution, a compromise of user data at the IDP can have an adverse legal impact on the RP because of GDPR privacy requirements. Unless IDP and RP have figured out how to share such liability, this will become an unpleasant surprise to users and RPs. Would either of you care to comment on this legal vulnerability gap? So any comments or thoughts in general about how Federation and FIDO interplay with the GDPR?
I can answer the first part. FIDO is very complementary to federated identity. FIDO fits perfectly into federation protocols like OAuth2 or OpenID Connect. We actually have implementations that are based on federated identities. So there is no particular obstacle to using FIDO with a federated identity system.
Yeah, the thing I would add is, there was that great slide at the beginning that Alan went through, which was the pyramid. I think it was, slide 3 or slide 4 in the deck that, laid out where FIDO fits in the broader identity stack. And, FIDO alone, FIDO authentication is quite simple and doesn't really present any, sort of complicated liability issues. FIDO technically integrates very well with Federation, and there's some great examples that are out there of how FIDO is being used alongside federated identity solutions to deliver what I guess I would call a more full feature identity solution. But Federation has always had its own set of legal issues that go with it. There's nothing about FIDO in and of itself that solves those, other than I think the benefits of having strong authentication based on public key cryptography as opposed to something that's a little bit weaker can certainly help attorneys such as those I work with in my firm, better assess the risks of, something going wrong in the solution. So in that regard, there's, something to note there.
Okay, thank you. So that are there any other questions? That brings us to, here's one. The question refers to a compromise of PII data at the IDP. There's a follow-up then, thus leaking information about the user using specific RPs, not about an authentication compromise at IDPs. So going back to the federation question, so if user PII is compromised at the identity provider, does this cause added risk?
Again, I think from a federation perspective, I mean, going back to the point I made before, look, FIDO on its own solves a lot of problems. If you start dealing with the broader set of things in that pyramid that we had in the slide earlier, I don't know if it's possible, to go back to, I think it was slide 8, was looking at things like single sign-on, federation, user management, identity proofing. Identity is complicated. Authentication is getting a lot easier at a time when perhaps other parts of identity are getting a little bit harder. So I wouldn't want to spend too much time opining on some of the broader challenges we have right now in the federated identity space when it comes to liability, other than to say, at least to the extent we're talking about FIDO, that and other high assurance authentication, if it's being used, can really help to reduce some of the risks that are out there.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks everybody for joining today. That brings us to the end of our webinar. If there's added questions, please do send them to us at help@FIDOalliance.org, and we'll be happy to answer them there. The webinar recording and slides will be emailed to you in the next probably 24 to 48 hours. And if you would take a moment, to fill out the survey, I would greatly appreciate it. So thank you all very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future FIDO webinar. Thank you.